April 29th, 2026, Edward Rod Larsen, the son of two Norwegian diplomats, dies in Oslo. His body was found 3 days after an international investigation was launched into his parents' relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. So, what was going on between his family and Epstein? And why was Edward set to inherit $5 million from Epstein's estate? Well, these are going to be some of the questions I'm going to try and get to the bottom of in this video. Now, today we're covering a very different type of case because usually I talk about pretty straightforward true crime cases on this channel. I mean, usually there's a crime, a criminal, a victim, and a verdict. But this one isn't really like that because in this case, there isn't a lot of clear answers. There's just so much ambiguity and a lot of this is still ongoing. So just be prepared for a story that won't necessarily have a conclusion. And just keep in mind that I'm talking about the son of two famous diplomats. But in some ways, this isn't just about him or his life. He's just someone who, unfortunately, was born into something way bigger than him. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel for more weekly true crime videos. April 2026, in Oslo, Norway, the son of two senior diplomats suddenly died. Edward Jules Rod Larsen, and he was only 25 years old. Now, at first, people outside of Norway had no idea who Edward was because he wasn't a celebrity or a really famous politician or public figure or anything. But almost immediately, international headlines erupted because of who his parents were and this huge scandal that was unfolding around them. And within days of Edward's passing, family representatives confirmed that he died by suicide. The public in Norway was completely shocked by his death, and all of these questions started popping up. Why was his death suddenly making the front page news in relation to one of the biggest scandals tied to Jeffrey Epstein? Now, before we can answer that question and to fully understand why Edward's story matters, we need to know exactly who his parents were. Because in Norway, Mona Juul and Terry Rod Larsen, they weren't just ordinary officials, they were basically like diplomatic royalty. Now, Mona and Terry, they got married in 1998 and they've been married for nearly 40 years. They met through their work because they're both, diplomats and they work in the same field. And they're basically one of Norway's most celebrated diplomatic couples. And in case you don't know what a diplomat is, it's basically just an official who represents their country when it comes to dealings with other countries. Now, a defining moment happened for them in their careers back in 1993 because they were a part of a small team that helped facilitated the Oslo Accords, which was basically a historic peace agreement between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization. Terry and Mona, they were there to basically help, make sure the negotiation went smoothly. They allowed communication between both parties. Like, they played a very important role in this, and this was a huge breakthrough and was heavily celebrated within the Middle East, right? Because as we all know, especially with what's going on in our current day, this was a pretty big deal back then, and it would have been even now. Now, because of their part in the Oslo Accords, they weren't just recognized in Norway anymore. Now they became respected figures internationally. So from there, both of their careers popped off. For Mona, she went on to serve as Norway's ambassador to Israel, United Kingdom, Iraq, Jordan, and the United Nations from 1990s until 2026. Now, an ambassador is basically a diplomat, just a diplomat who has the highest ranking. Now, for Terry, he actually became president of the International Peace Institute in New York in 2005, and he led this organization for 16 years. And I'm going to be referring to the International Peace Institute as the IPI from this point forward because it's just a lot easier that way. But the IPI was basically a think tank that was located near the UN, and they were focused on conflict resolution and international security. And a think tank is basically an organization that has a bunch of researchers and experts that study specific issues that could be anything to do with politics, economics, and international relations. Now, when you look at Mona and Terry, even just as individuals and as a couple, they kind of seem perfect, right? They're famous, internationally recognized diplomats with connections to the most exclusive circles. And of course, if they had any kids, they were pretty much going to be set for life, right? Well, that's exactly what happened in the early 2000s because Mona gave birth to twins, one boy and one girl. And when she gave birth to them, the Norwegian public actually nicknamed them the Peace Twins because of just how influential their parents were. So basically, from the day they were born, they were already connected to their parents' reputation, whether they wanted to be or not. Now, one of the twins was Edward Lawson, which is going to be the focus of our story today. Now, he lived a lot of his life out of sight, surprisingly, even though his parents were quite, well-known influential figures in Norway and internationally and blah, blah, blah. But he was a very private person. So there's not that much public information about him. But what we do know is that during his childhood, he moved around a lot because of his parents' work. He lived in Israel for a little while due to his mom's diplomatic work. He lived in New York and went to school there. He lived in England and went to boarding school there. He's bilingual in both Norwegian and English. He was raised in multiple countries and different cultures. And of course, on paper, this sounds very glamorous. And don't get me wrong, being able to move around like this is a huge privilege to be able to see the world that way and experience it from such a young age like that. But there's also very little stability. I mean, considering the fact he went to boarding school, and considering what his parents did, they probably weren't around that much. So he was probably raised more by, helpers and that sort of thing. So even though they were privileged, they didn't necessarily have a normal childhood either. Now, his adult life was, like I said, mostly private, despite having two prominent figures as parents. He really just didn't like being in the spotlight. And before his death in 2026, very few people actually knew much about him, but that was going to change completely and not by his own choosing. The reputation his parents had built was obviously very impressive, but the higher up you go in those types of circles, the more certain names keep reappearing. And one name in particular was going to change everything for this family, and that was Jeffrey Epstein. Now, I'm going to keep it very simple here because if you're clicking on this video, then you probably already know who he is. I mean, who wouldn't know who he is, right? But Epstein was basically an extraordinarily wealthy and powerful financier who had connections to and influence over some of the world's most important people, from politicians to royalty to celebrities and everything else in between. And then he was arrested on sex trafficking charges and died in prison in 2019. Now, official reports say he killed himself, but everyone knows that's not true. So after Epstein's death, right, a lot of names connected to his network started coming out publicly. And all of this was being exposed by journalists. You had documents and financial records basically exposing decades of relationships between Epstein and some of the most powerful people in the world, right? And among those names were two Norwegian diplomats. In one of the documents that was revealed, Terry Lawson's name was there, and they could see that he actually had a connection with Epstein through the IPI, the organization that he had led for 16 years. But their relationship with one another happened way, way before all of this was revealed. So seeing the IPI connection was kind of like the first time the public was like, oh, you're connected to Epstein, because what had happened was Epstein donated a lot of money to the IPI. So it shows that Terry obviously had, a conflict of interest there if Epstein is, donating a bunch of money to the organization that he was leading. Now, for Epstein in particular, this wasn't necessarily unusual for him because he was known to have attachments to so many different powerful institutions from, oh my gosh, like research, politics, anything in tech, Hollywood. So even though it's disgusting, it wasn't necessarily surprising on his end. But for Terry, it was going to look so bad for him. It was going to look way worse for him as more information was going to come out far beyond him just having a connection with Epstein through the IPI. Because after Epstein's death, and now you have all of this scrutiny that's happening towards everyone that's connected to him, I mean, rightfully so, all of this was being really intensified, right? And this was especially the case for Terry because he was implicated in something that he couldn't just try to explain away. Like there's just so much on him. It's crazy. So it was revealed that he took a personal loan of $130,000 from Epstein in 2013. And this was not a donation for an institute or anything like that. This was a personal loan to him directly, and he never disclosed it. And when the IPI found out about all of this, right, and Terry's connection to Epstein, they held an emergency board meeting. And the IPI board chairman described the revelation as deeply disturbing, because it is deeply disturbing. And Terry did try to apologize many times publicly, trying to do what he can to stay in this position of power. But he did end up resigning from the organization. Now, even though Terry claimed it was a grave error of judgment, The IPI didn't care. They were very swift and very severe with their consequences. Because if you think about it, right, this is literally an institution that was built on the values of peace and integrity. And finding out that one of your leaders had been taking personal loans from someone who is a convicted sex trafficker and one of the most notorious criminals in modern history. I mean, of course, the reputational damage was huge. Now, with all of this coming to light, of course, people were asking all of these different questions. Did Terry know what Epstein was doing but decided to ignore it? Or did he know exactly who Epstein was and what he was doing and was maybe a part of it in some ways and, just didn't care? Because at this point, the scandal heavily revolved around Terry, right? But that was about to change because the attention slowly started shifting over to his wife, Mona, as well. Obviously, when her husband got implicated in all of this, she started getting involved too, and she was questioned about her relationship with Epstein. Now, at first, she said that they were acquaintances, that they barely knew each other, their contact was super limited. But as investigation progressed, it was very clear that they knew each other really well. So then she kind of backtracked what she said at first and she told investigators that her first answer to them had been imprecise. Like that was the specific word she used because she did know Epstein for many, many years and they were actually quite close. But the reason she used the word imprecise is because obviously she doesn't want to admit that she lied. She's just, trying to make it seem like it was just very poor wording on her end. Now, obviously, this is very, very problematic because Mona was a senior Norwegian diplomat, literally representing her country at the highest level. She had security clearances, and her position held just so much trust from institutions. So, obviously, none of this sat well with Norwegian authorities or the Norwegian public. So now you have so much, suspicions growing around not just Mona, but of course her husband. And people were wondering, whether Epstein had offered the couple more stuff beyond just the donation to the IPI, more than the personal loan of $130,000. Because people knew enough from the Epstein story to know that it probably didn't end there. And they were right. Because you guessed it, there's more. There is just so much dirt on these people. After Epstein had died, he executed a final will. And when it became public, people recognized two names on there that were connected to Terry and Mona. And that was the Peace Twins, Edward Lawson and his twin sister Emma. Epstein had named the Rod Lawson children as beneficiaries to his will. Now, there's conflicting reports because some say that each sibling was going to get $5 million or they were going to get 10 mil collectively. But the details aside, right? This is just so weird. And there's something that I wanted to mention. They were going to get the same amount as Ghislaine Maxwell, right? And not only that, Epstein had around 40 people on his will. And out of all of them, the two of those names on there was the children of Norwegian diplomats. Like, that's just so weird, right? Why would Jeffrey Epstein leave millions of dollars to the children of Norwegian diplomats? At this point, we already know that they have direct ties to Epstein, but this is obviously something else entirely because you don't leave millions of dollars to the children of just like old work friends or someone who's just your acquaintance. But you might do that for people that you're really close with and had a relationship with for many, many years. But for Edward specifically, right? His case is strange because he's a very private person who never wanted any public attention. From what we know, he doesn't have any connection to Jeffrey Epstein. And now, against his will, his name is now appearing in international headlines alongside one of the most toxic names in modern history. As reporters dug deeper, more uncomfortable details were revealed. In 2011, documents showed that the family had actually traveled on Epstein's private jet with Edward, with Emma, like the whole family was there. And allegedly, okay, this is alleged, that they had apparently visited some of Epstein's properties, including his private Caribbean island. Although this is not 100% fact, so I'm not going to sit here and say that that's true. This is all alleged, so take everything with a grain of salt. But when you hear that a child's name appears in Epstein's files, it's obviously very, very, very concerning, and that they had potentially traveled on his aircraft, maybe even visiting his private Caribbean island. It's so icky. But kind of thankfully, no actual public records show that there was any sort of solid evidence, no court filings, no documents that suggested Edward was victimized by Epstein or anyone in his circle, including his sister. Now, we have to keep in mind that the only time Edward had some sort of contact with Epstein, from what we know, was when he was literally a child. And he didn't obviously have any say in who his parents were associated with or where they were going to go altogether. Like, he didn't choose any of this. And there's no public record that gives us any basis to suggest that he was anything other than just a really private person who got caught up in his parents' wrongdoings. By early 2026, the situation stopped being a reputational scandal and became a criminal one. Norway's anti-corruption agency, Økokrim, and I may be saying that really wrong, I apologize, launched a formal investigation into Mona and Terry. So Mona was being investigated for suspicion of aggravated corruption linked to her diplomatic role, and Terry was being investigated for complicity in aggravated corruption. And of course, both of them denied any wrongdoing, and their lawyer issued a statement saying that there was no basis for any criminal liability. But the thing is, this investigation wasn't just in Norway. This was happening internationally because France also had their own investigation in relation to the Epstein files. So you have Norway and France that were communicating and coordinating with each other, sharing information. So this investigation was huge. It wasn't just Mona and Terry. Like, obviously, it's way, way bigger than them. They're just like two pawns in this whole thing. But it just goes to show, like, just how much impact this case had. And not only that, like, they are two very influential people that had a lot of power, a lot of authority. They were literally involved in the Oslo Accords that was about peace and reunion between Israel and Palestine. And especially with everything that's going on in our current world with Gaza, it just really makes you question, can we trust the people who are supposed to be leading us and supposed to be protecting us? Because within the Epstein files as well, Terry had literally described Epstein as his best friend and a thoroughly good human. There was even a photo in the Epstein files that showed a photograph of Terry holding his phone up, showing a social media page of a woman in a bikini. But that specific part of his phone had actually been redacted to protect that woman. So obviously, this is no longer just gossip about some disgraced diplomat and a dead sex offender. This was an active, escalating international criminal investigation with the Rod Lawson family name appearing in the headlines almost daily around the world. So as the investigation was progressing, a very specific allegation emerged that made it very difficult for Mona and Terry to maintain their image of innocence. Because in 2018, years after Epstein's crimes had, begun attracting serious public scrutiny, he had allegedly helped Mona and Terry purchase an apartment in Oslo. But the seller really wanted to back out of this deal because the seller would lose $1.5 million because Mona and Terry were offering basically half the price of what it was actually worth. But then Epstein got involved and he sent an email warning that seller that things would become unpleasant for him if he did back out, like literally straight up blackmailing him, right? So you have a convicted sex offender allegedly pursuing a property seller on behalf of senior Norwegian diplomats. It just shows that their connection with him was far beyond something that could just be brushed off as minimal. There are multiple incidents now connecting them to Epstein. Like, you can't deny any of this. And it gets worse. Okay, it gets worse because there were visa letters. There were these documents that showed Terry had written official letters of recommendation to US authorities on behalf of young Russian women who were connected to Epstein. And he described them as people who, possessed extraordinary abilities suitable for research positions. But these were fraudulent letters. These were not true because these women were not only very young and very beautiful, they were models from Eastern Europe with no academic background at all. You can tell that they very clearly fit the profile of woman we know Epstein was trafficking and abusing and exploiting. So you have Terry, a peace negotiator, a diplomat, a man who built his entire career on the idea of protecting the vulnerable, using his power to help Jeffrey Epstein traffic women into the United States. Like, this is just a level of corruption that is just pure evil. So by 2026, the consequences did come very fast, but I think not severe enough. Mona was placed on administrative leave. She had her security clearance revoked. She resigned as Norway's ambassador to Jordan. And even the Norway's foreign ministry issued a public statement And they said that this was a serious lapse of judgment in connection to Epstein. Now, due to the media frenzy that surrounded this family, and as investigation was intensifying, there was also a lot of attention that was put onto Edward and Emma. Even though they lived a really private life before all of this, their whole world now had basically blown up in their face. Like they couldn't live a normal life anymore. Whenever they would leave their home in Norway or kind of just anywhere, they would constantly, be berated by journalists and reporters and paparazzi. And yeah, they didn't ask for any of this. Their names were connected to Epstein in a will, but from what we know, they had nothing to do with this. So the position that they were in was it was very, very difficult. And obviously, we know just how ruthless the internet can be. Even though there was no public evidence suggesting Edward had any sort of criminal connection to Jeffrey Epstein or any knowledge of what he was doing, it didn't matter. People online were still speculating. People were very aggressive. And this was all over the news as well, in Norwegian headlines too. So no matter what Edward would say, or, no matter how hard he tried to kind of like change the narrative, it was just all working against him, whether he wanted to or not. So then on April 29th of 2026, Edward Jule Rod Lawson died in Oslo at just 25 years old from suicide. Now, the timing of his death was impossible to separate from everything that was going on. He died 3 days after an investigation was established between the Norwegian and French police into his parents. And the internet also responded to all of this really immediately. People were very loud about this situation with very little patience for nuance. So, of course, again, you have conspiracy theories that are starting to spread like wildfire. And people were making direct lines between Epstein investigation and his death. People were saying things like maybe he knew something and maybe he was killed and this was a cover up. And they're just saying it was a suicide when it wasn't. But nonetheless, he was still a human being. And from what we know, there was zero evidence that he participated in any of Epstein's crimes or any crimes at all. He possibly took his own life because his whole world just blew up in his face and everything he had known basically changed forever. Now, after Edward's death, the family did release statements pushing back against the speculation, and they talked about how there was, so much overwhelming public pressure and just so much scrutiny that the family as a whole was facing. And I don't really feel sympathetic towards Mona or especially Terry, but I feel sympathetic to their children. Like they did not deserve that. And they were just dragged into this mess, right? So obviously, when this happened, the family requested privacy and just some space to grieve. And they said very clearly that there was no definite connection between Edward's death and the Epstein investigation. And they basically said that suicide is very complex and cannot be explained by just one cause or one person. So they never said why he did it or what truly happened. So we will never know, right? But what we do know is that Edward was just 25 years old. He grew up as a very private person. He didn't want to be in the spotlight at all, despite who his parents were. And then suddenly his name is everywhere attached to this horrific scandal with Jeffrey Epstein, right? So whether the pressure of this situation contributed to his death, we will never know. Or if his death was the result of other factors entirely, we will just never know. So obviously there's a lot in this case that we don't know and just a lot of ambiguity. So what is confirmed was that Edward's name did appear on Epstein's will, and his parents are under active criminal investigation tied to their relationship with Epstein. But what is not confirmed is whether Edward received a single penny from Epstein's estate, whether the scrutiny directly contributed to his death, and we will never know what Edward himself actually knew or felt or understood about his family's relationship with Epstein, unless maybe one day his sister decides to speak out against it. Now, even though Edward's story is very heartbreaking and so tragic, it's unfortunately just one thread in something much, much larger. Terry Rod Lawson and Mona Jule are two of the most decorated diplomats Norway has ever produced. Helped broker one of the most celebrated peace agreements of the 20th century, built their careers on the idea of integrity, peace, and protecting the vulnerable, and they allegedly maintained a years-long relationship with a man who was running one of the most prolific sex trafficking operations in modern history, allegedly receiving financial benefits from him, helping him obtain visas for young women he was exploiting. And as of May 2026, neither of them have faced a single legal consequence for any of it. and they still deny any wrongdoing. Now, the broader lesson of the Epstein story is that no matter how many files gets released or wills get published, people with the most to lose are also those with the most resources to ensure that nothing will ever actually happen to them. Even though all of these investigations are ongoing, the documents keep coming out, and the full picture of just how many powerful people enabled Jeffrey Epstein and what they received in return is still nowhere close to being told. Now, if you guys enjoyed today's video, let me know in the comment section down below. Just let me know whatever thoughts you have about this whole case, because it's so crazy and there's just so much involved. But if you liked this sort of case in relation to Jeffrey Epstein, let me know. Possibly we can do more of this on the channel. Nonetheless, make sure you guys leave a like and subscribe if you haven't, and take care. I'll see you in the next one.